Vladimir Lenin, the messiah of international communism, has been dead for almost 40 years, but his satanic message lives on.
Let me teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted.
From state-operated nursery on, each child is pumped full of hate with red lies and godless doctrines. The USSR Teacher's Gazette boldly declares that the Soviet teacher, and we quote, is obliged not only to be an unbeliever himself, but also to be an active propagandist of godlessness among others.
Upper grades consist primarily of vocational training. The only students permitted to get a higher education are those whose parents are influential party members or those found reliable by communist standards.
Universities and colleges are open only to those who can procure a certificate of political reliability. From kindergarten to college, communists work to destroy religious influences and parental authority. Children are turned against their parents and taught to be state informers.
A Ural peasant, the father of 12-year-old Pavlik Morozov, was one of many victims of this vicious indoctrination. In order to feed his family, the elder Morozov withheld from the state food collectors a small portion of grain. Denounced by his young son, he was sentenced to 10 years of forced labor.
For this deed, Pavlik, the informer, is the exalted ideal for communist youth. Family life is further undermined by low incomes that force women and children to work, and by crowded living conditions, since all construction and housing is state-controlled.
In an American city, the average family of four has almost 1,400 square feet of living space.
In a Soviet city, an average family of four is permitted a living area that measures about 12 by 13 feet. 3 families would be sharing one outmoded kitchen in their state-owned dwelling. For 12 people, there would be one water faucet. The use of 3 electrical outlets would be shared by these 12 people. The Russians used this picture in a propaganda magazine to show Americans the excellence of their housing. Even though shoddy and unattractive by American standards, this apartment is a much-sought prize in the Soviet Union. Inadequate living conditions are a result of the Kremlin's demands for increased production of munitions and heavy industry. This, in turn, is hampered by inefficient methods dictated by the party. The state-managed steel mills of the Soviet Union, even though working at full capacity, only produced about 72 million tons annually.
At only partial operating capacity, the American steel industry's annual production was almost 100 million tons.
This graph shows the result of the emphasis on heavy industry in Russia. In 1913, before communism, consumer goods represented 2/3 of all production. By 1955, under communist rule, the percentage of consumer goods had slumped to less than 1/3 of total production. In the Soviet Union and its satellites, each shop and factory has a quota system. If a worker or his group falls short of the quota set by the efficiency experts, his pay is docked. These red-style efficiency experts are usually reliable communists whose political careers depend on pushing the quotas higher and higher.
Rarely will a worker in this Soviet automobile factory be able to own what he makes. Most of the 1/2 million cars and trucks produced per year are destined for use by the military or party functionaries. Few are privately owned. Any American worker can own one of the nearly 7 million automobiles manufactured in the United States each year.
Yet the average worker under a Kremlin-style government must work longer today to buy most necessities than he did before communism. As an example, let's take the simple necessity, a loaf of bread. In Poland in 1938, before communism, 10 minutes of a man's labor paid for a loaf of bread. In 1957, under the communist regime, it took exactly twice that long, 20 minutes. This was true in all the Iron Curtain countries. In Romania before, 14 minutes. After, 19 minutes. Latvia before, 8 minutes. After, 20 minutes. Double and more. In Poland, before the communists took over, it required 40 hours of a man's work to buy a pair of shoes. But in 1957, 12 years after the takeover, the figure was 97 hours. In Romania, before, 45 hours. After, 77 hours. In Latvia, 17 hours before. Under communism, 125 hours.
An American works 6 hours and 40 minutes for a pair of men's leather shoes. In the Soviet Union, after 45 years of communist rule, it takes 29 hours of a man's labor to pay for a pair of work shoes.
A file is kept on each person at his place of work. This comprehensive political and personal record is begun with the first year of school. It is kept up to date with details gained from informers and from repeated interviews with the worker and his associates. A similar file at secret police headquarters holds absolute control over the existence of each individual. The low wages paid the average worker by the state are reduced even further by hidden taxes and numerous deductions. Enforced enrollment for peace loans and 5-year plan loans take 5 to 10% of a worker's earnings. There are no strikes in the workers' paradise, not because the workers are satisfied, but because they are deprived by law of all right to strike. The communists work at presenting a facade of democracy. This is an election in communist Poland. The people are required to vote. However, there is only a single list of candidates, featuring the names of communists and communist puppets. The ballot is marked and put in the ballot box under the watchful eye of the party official. The only means of protest is revolt. Soviet tanks moved against East Berlin workers who were shouting for bread and freedom. After this revolt, 50,000 East Germans were imprisoned. A similar revolt in Hungary went much farther. A genuinely spontaneous uprising, the Hungarian freedom fighters were drawn from the ranks of workers, students, peasants, business, and professional people. Their few glorious but fearful days of freedom were ended when Khrushchev sent in 5,000 tanks and 200,000 Soviet troops. To examine communist justice, we can move closer to home, to Cuba, only 90 miles off the Florida coast. Soon after he came to power, Fidel Castro held show trials of Batista followers. In a circus atmosphere, wild accusations were encouraged. Hundreds were executed. Then came the trials of disillusioned ex-revolutionaries. Critical of the direction the revolution had taken, 300,000 were imprisoned and others executed. Judgments were made on a political basis. There is a precedent for this, of course, in communist justice.
The Czechoslovak Minister of National Security stated in 1952, "The question as to who is guilty and who is innocent will in the end be decided by the party with the help of the national security organs."
In a January 1961 issue of U.S. News and World Report, Dr. Emilio Menendez, Cuba's former Chief Justice, who resigned his position in 1960 and took refuge in the United States, declared in a copyrighted interview that Cuba no longer is a state of law. Rather, the will of the government is the law. Any policeman or Army intelligence soldier can enter your home, take you to jail, search your home, and you never know why. Just all of a sudden, one day, you find yourself before a revolutionary court made up of soldiers. Most of these soldiers have no experience in law at all. As Castro's regime floundered and food became scarce, Castro instituted strict rationing of Cuba's rapidly diminishing food supply. Added to this was a reign of terror against the farmers in an attempt to force higher output. But Castro wasn't alone with his agricultural problems. Hunger and starvation was on the march in Red China, Russia, and her satellites. This is the Iron Curtain, a wall of concrete, iron, and steel that separates the free world from the Kremlin's slave empire. Shrouded in ominous silence are the barbed wire and electric fences, guard towers and minefields, armed patrols, and floodlighted entanglements that span the perimeter of every communist-dominated frontier. It starts at the Arctic Ocean. Moving southward, it then skirts the Soviet coastline along the Baltic. It seals off Poland, then cuts through the heart of Germany, and envelops the captive nations of East Central Europe. Turning eastward, it continues through Asia to Red China and its hungry millions. This 11,000-mile border encircles 15 million square miles, 1/4 of the world's land surface. Behind the heavily patrolled boundaries live 1 billion people, captives of the communist empire. The communists had claimed everyone was happy in the workers' paradise and the Iron Curtain was only for defense. But in the divided city of Berlin, the real truth was there for all the world to see. Escapers from communism spoke of miserable living conditions, incessant economic pressures, and the constant fear of prison, deportation, or death. In all, over 12 million have fled communist oppression.
From East Germany alone, an estimated 3.5 million have fled to the West. Of these, the majority were skilled workers and farmers. 1/2 were young people under 25 who sought freedom in spite of the years of communist indoctrination. Many were substantial self-employed business and professional men escaping with their families. This continuous flow created an acute labor shortage at all levels in East Germany and proved the claim of contentment in the People's Republic a lie.
To halt this loss, the notorious Berlin Wall was constructed. This was in violation of the four power agreements. Windows and doors were bricked up, and every escape route along the 30-mile border was sealed off. Families and friends were forcibly separated. 73 crossing points were closed. Only 7 remained as points of entry, and East German guards closely checked all identification. Desperate and ingenious escape methods were devised. This reinforced truck plowed head-on through the Berlin Wall. Others have tunneled under it. More than 6,000 people have managed to escape since the wall was built. This defecting airman took an easy route over the Iron Curtain. But for most Russians, there is seldom an opportunity to escape. Few but the trusted elite are allowed travel permits, and even with them, contact with the free world produces disillusionment with communism.
In New York, an example of this occurred at the Soviet consulate. A teacher of the consulate officials' children, Madame Oksana Kosenkina, jumped from a third-story window rather than return to Russia. Seriously injured, she was rescued by New York police and given sanctuary in America.
More recently, Rudolf Nureyev, one of the artistic elite, made a sudden bid for freedom and won. The leading male dancer of Leningrad's Kirov Opera Company, Nureyev is now winning new laurels in the West as the star of a French ballet company. Viktor Janomets, a member of the hand-picked crew on Khrushchev's yacht, slipped away to safety during the dictator's UN visit. Also, members of a privileged class were the more than 11,000 East German soldiers and People's Police who have defected to the West. The grim face of communism turns their eyes to the freedom beyond the barricade. Leaving everything behind, this young border guard suddenly leaped across the red barrier to the free world. But other members of the People's Police dutifully prevent escapes. They shoot to kill. West Berliners placed this cross near the wall. Translated, it says, "Driven to death by Vopos. Bernd Lunzer died for his freedom."
How does communism exist if it is so intolerable to the people it rules?
The means of Soviet control must be examined in order to answer that question. Highest official body of the entire Communist Party is the Presidium, the obedient servant of the Soviet dictator The Presidium's decisions are implemented by the Communist Party and its leaders in each communist-dominated country. These puppets set in motion the huge bureaucracy of communism, which plans and controls the economic activity of the Soviet Union as well as its colonial empire. The secret police, with its vast network of agents and informers, is a constant deterrent to anyone wanting to break a regime's established pattern. The Red Army poses an enormous threat to opposition beyond the capacity of the secret police. Some of communism's easiest conquests were made in the years following World War II. Aided by the enormous destruction and social chaos in many countries at the war's end. Since that time, tactics based on infiltration and subversion have proven successful in many parts of the world. Kremlin agents capitalize on governmental weaknesses and the aspirations of underdeveloped areas. The poor and gullible are incited to revolt, with glowing promises of a better life for all who follow the red banner. Behind a facade of phony people's democracy, democratic leaders are purged. These 2 East Germans were executed because they opposed the communist regime.
In Katyn Forest were found the bodies of 4,000 of 15,000 missing Polish officers who were Russian prisoners of war. Because they were potential leaders of opposition in post-war Poland, these helpless captives were liquidated by the communists. 11,000 are yet to be found.
Near Hamhung, Korea, 300 South Korean peasant leaders were sealed up alive in caves by the invading North Koreans. Anticipating total conquest of Korea, the communists had begun their methodical elimination of all people likely to head a revolt. After the invaders were pushed northward by the UN forces, weeping relatives searched the long rows of dead for husbands, brothers, and sons. In every country being subjugated, mass executions are carried out by the communists to terrorize the population into obedience. Terror and tyranny are the basis of communist control. When all democratic leaders have been removed, a new class with a strong vested interest in the Red regime is then created. It often includes criminals released by invading Russians. The convictions of these thugs range from petty theft to murder. They were appointed by the Russians as government officials and functionaries, some as members of the secret police. Once communist control is established, newspapers and magazines are rigidly censored, and print articles that are inventions of the propagandists with little relation to facts. Innocent classics and books by approved communist authors are the only ones allowed in libraries and bookstores. Communist-controlled mass media spreads the party line throughout the country. The people are told what the regime demands of them. Religious services and church activities are closely regulated as a prelude to religious persecution. Protesting clergymen are arrested or transferred to remote parts of the country. It is mostly the old who cling to their religion, for the young are taught atheistic beliefs. Worship of God is replaced by worship of Lenin. Outside his huge concrete mausoleum in Red Square, hundreds of the party faithful wait patiently to worship at the communist shrine. After 40 years of collectivization and relentless agricultural planning, Russia's state-owned farms lagged behind pre-war production. Farmers on these enormous state-owned farms are hired hands. Those on collectives are sharecroppers.
The Soviet farmer produces only enough to feed himself and 4 other people. By comparison, an American farmer produces enough to feed himself and 26 other people.
Only on the tiny private plots allotted to these once independent farmers can individual enterprise and ingenuity be exercised. These little gardens, which make up only 4% of the tilled land, produce half of the milk, meat, and vegetables, 80% of the eggs, and more than 60% of the potatoes consumed by the Russian people. A rebuke to the whole system of socialized agriculture. The Russian farmer did not give up his independence willingly. In fact, Stalin admitted to Churchill that collectivization had cost more lives than World War II.
In the Ukraine alone, more than 6 million peasants who resisted collectivization had been forcibly starved to death.
Even in the satellites, the costly failure of collectivization was apparent. 1961's total harvest in Eastern Europe was scarcely better than pre-war production in the same area. Significantly, the best yield was in Poland, where some 86% of the land is now privately owned and worked. But if farm output was bad in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Cuba, it was catastrophic in Red China. Mao Zedong, in planning the Chinese economy, had favored industry with a huge percentage of the nation's capital investment, but allowing only 8% to agriculture. The gross industrial product increased greatly, but farm production rose scarcely enough to feed the population growth. After several preliminary stages, including the dispossession of large landowners, the Chinese Reds forced complete collectivization that eliminated even the smallest private ownership of land. 20 million who objected were executed. Their deaths served as a warning to others with similar ideas. The communes introduced military concepts into farming, with cadres or kanpus who carried out Beiping's policies. China's 100 million peasant families were broken up. Children became wards of the Beiping government and were placed in state-operated nurseries or schools where education and training were directed by the Red regime. Husbands and wives were assigned to separate barracks and mess halls. From 24,000 Spartan communes, the peasants were routed from bed at dawn and marched off to the fields. At the sound of the kanpu's whistle, they seized rifles for close-order drill. At another signal, they hurried to their tasks of plowing, weeding, planting, or reaping. Ignorance, mismanagement, and loss of all personal incentive produced a nationwide famine. China's total grain harvest in 1961 was less than in 1957, and there were 60 million more Chinese to be fed. The food ration was cut to a little more than 1,000 calories a day. In the West, 2,000 calories a day are considered the minimum for office work.
Even in once fertile Shantung province, so many were dying of starvation that they were being buried in mass graves, reported to Red Chinese pilots who defected.
In the countries scarred by hammer and sickle, hunger was on the march. Attempts were made to blame communism's agricultural failures on old mistakes of Stalin, and even on the hostility of the capitalistic West. The communists could no longer shift the blame to the upper classes. They had been eliminated under communism. Workers were promised a classless society, equal income, control of the government and the economy. Yet today, Soviet incomes are grossly unequal within a new hierarchy of classes.
The dictator has replaced the Tsar.
Next to him is the new royal family, the Secretariat, consisting of never more than 25 people with unlimited incomes and privileges. Next in line is the royal officialdom of the party elite and the most important artists and scientists. They represent 1/10,000th of 1% of the Russian people. Each receives a monthly income of $20,000, in addition to special stores, cars, yachts, and other privileges. Next are the top officials, the aristocratic echelon composed of top bureaucrats, generals, industrial managers, important artists and scientists.
They represent 1.5% of the population, and monthly incomes are equivalent to about $2,500. They also get special privileges of stores, cars, and villas.
The bureaucrats are the minor aristocracy, civil servants, party bureaucracy, professionals, Stakhanovite workers.
This 15.5% of the Soviet people are paid a monthly income of approximately $400.
The peasants and workers are still next to the bottom of the ladder.
Representing 80% of the population, their monthly income equals about $160.
At the bottom of this monolithic structure are the forced laborers. 3% of Russia's over 200 million work at a starvation level.
The map of the Red Empire is dotted with the locations of forced labor camps. Each country that has fallen to communist tyranny has supplied its share of the 20 million slave laborers that became part of the Soviet economy.
But the economic importance of the slave camps is slight when compared with their value as links in the chain of terror that holds together the empire. Lie, treachery, torture, slavery, and murder are used deliberately to gain communist ends. Mute testimony to communist inhumanity is offered by the graves of millions of victims of the Red March to world conquest. The peasants of the Ukraine, murdered by deliberate starvation. Massacred citizens of Latvia. The slaughtered Polish prisoners in Katyn Forest. The bullet-riddled bodies of Chinese who failed to conform. The South Korean villagers callously buried alive. The victims of Castro's bloodbath in Cuba. Is it any wonder that millions have sought to escape this tyranny? Even though they risk death, materialistic communism has failed to provide even the basic necessities of life for its people. The drab reality of hunger and scarcity of consumer goods has revealed the glittering promises of communism as fraudulent. Still, Khrushchev brazenly declares that communism will take over the United States from within. He boasts of a 1973 deadline for the downfall of the United States. Today, we and all the free world are faced with the dangerous consequences of Soviet and Red Chinese failures. Desperate measures are needed by the Red overlords to shift attention from communism's bankruptcy. The more acute their crisis, the greater our danger from their aggression. We must awake to this threat before it is too late. We should have confidence in America's industrial might and agricultural wealth. These are the products of free men working together in one nation under God. America's liberty has been purchased with the blood and sacrifices of its patriots, whose ideals have made our country the refuge and symbol of hope for the oppressed peoples of the world. We must understand the source of our great strength in order to preserve the ideals which have nurtured it. Freedom can only exist where the will and determination of the people are strong enough to preserve this precious heritage.